Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Change with the Times or Get Left Behind, Measure ROI for today's RCM automation strategies. I'm Giles Bruce, and on behalf of Becker's Healthcare, welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can type those into the Q&A box you see on your screen. You will find a few engagement tools on your dashboard. Please check out our resources section and also make sure you fill out our session survey. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access that recording. Lastly, if at any time you have trouble with the audio or video, please try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions into the Q&A box, and we are here to help. I'd now like to hand the floor over to Amy Raymond to introduce herself and to get things started.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for joining me for our talk today. I'll start by a short introduction. My name is Amy Raymond. I'm the Vice President of Revenue Cycle Operations at AKASA. Excuse me. I have spent about 25 years in my career in revenue cycle healthcare, in the healthcare space, working in almost every environment I can think of, from outsourced billing to health systems, practice management, and post-acute care, both in more traditional revenue cycle leadership, but then also in really heavy investment in implementations and tech-enabled process improvement. My most recent role prior to AKASA was at the advisory board as a director in the revenue cycle consulting services, where I supported health systems implementing EHRs, tech-enabled process improvement, like I mentioned before, as well as just kind of broad process improvement and business office redesign and things like that. And from there, I moved into managing or running the program management function for all of the performance technology services. So have quite a bit of rev cycle and some technology kind of blended in my background. I'm very passionate about process improvement and how overall process and structure can be improved with technology and automation specifically. So that's how I found myself at AKASA. And I'm excited to talk to you today about ROI and how to measure it. First, our learning objectives. We will understand how evolving technology might require us to change our framing of ROI, how we calculate it, and how we think about it. We'll discuss why a holistic approach is needed to capture the full impact of automation and AI, and I would argue even other tools that you're implementing for improvements. And we'll walk through identification of some key financial and soft ROI metrics and how they can impact, and then focus on how we can track them and how we should be weighing them when we consider the success of a project or an implementation. A quick note on some of the research. This presentation includes research and statistics from two primary sources. One, we commissioned research with the Health Management Academy that includes surveys and interviews with more than 40 leaders among the nation's 100 largest health systems, as well as industry experts. Our second source is research that we've conducted that was conducted by HFMA through a pulse survey program that includes responses from over 400 healthcare financial leaders. So let's jump in. We hear constantly that automation is top of mind. It's got a track in most conferences we go to today. We know it's top of mind for many healthcare leaders, and really the question isn't if, it's when at this point on implementing automation, but why. I probably don't need to tell you about staffing challenges, but we know we're still currently in a situation where staffing shortages are creating significant gaps. We are being told through survey that 1 in 4 healthcare finance leaders report needing to hire more than 20 employees to fully staff their revenue cycle departments. Turnover is still on the rise and wages are still increasing. And it takes on average 84 days to fill an entry-level rev cycle role, up to 207 days for a senior rev cycle talent. So literally every day of an open FTE headcount is costing you money, not just in the money it's going to take to increase the wage for the next person that comes in the door, the cost for recruiting, but also the cost of not having your work being done in their absence. On top of that, we've got volatile economic conditions. We've got unpredictable patient volumes, still somewhat recovering from COVID. Ballooning labor costs and sunsetting of pandemic relief funds have squeezed hospitals and their bottom line significantly. Granted, we see we're coming out on the other side as outpatient volumes continue to grow, which is good news, but not necessarily if you're severely understaffed and you already have overworked and overburdened staff. Many of you are likely facing the question of like, how do I get this handled? How can I do this work? And then third, or lastly, is that we're just seeing this openness to embracing technology. Approximately 45% of providers have accelerated software investments over the past year in the wake of immense cost pressures. A recent survey led by Bain & Kloss found that people are doubling down on investing in tech to fill these gaps and reduce costs. The survey found that the number one strategic priority for health tech spend is in revenue cycle management, which is not surprising to me, being in rev cycle and kind of hearing this, but it leads us to understanding why we hear that 78% of executives are seeking automation or have already started implementing automation with some portion of their revenue cycle within the next year. As we look at the impetus for putting RCM automation in place broadly, here are some of the top reasons that leaders are wanting to invest. It's not surprising that given all the financial pressures that revenue and cost optimization are top of mind for healthcare leaders, increasing yield, getting more revenue, reducing costs. And as you can see, with the exception of productivity, these metrics are all through the lens of finances and hard ROI. We have 60% increased revenue capture, 45% accelerate workflow, 35% increased cost savings, and 50% increased productivity. Thinking about these metrics, these are all things that CFOs and financial leaders really know how to measure from the outset, especially excluding productivity, and can start to see movement on when automation is fully deployed for over a year. But when you look at those three, you're also seeing that they're a lot of what we consider hard ROI, and what we have measurement tools in place for. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if we think about what to automate, how to automate to realize the biggest potential, see the largest ROI, you can follow a roadmap and, honestly, to maximize the most ROIs possible, automating every single thing ever that's possible would probably be your best bet. But if you're just starting out, that's not realistic. And it's important to sit down and think through how you want to automate and what the right kind of path is for you and your organization. Sure, there's a roadmap that can be followed from front to back or from low complexity to high complexity. There's many different ways you can look at it, but there's many areas of the revenue cycle that can be automated and are right for automation. And they're right for sophisticated AI, ML-based automation, not just RPA. So as you consider these, it's important to think through the fact that there's really no right answer, and it's up to you. Everyone's automation journey is different. You can start with something that feels more straightforward and simple in your organization to show a proof point to get adoption and acceptance of the ideas of automation. Sometimes that could be claim status, kind of get your foot in the door, see how the tool is working, and start getting adoption across the organization for broader automation. Or you could start with your biggest area that's a pain point or a big problem. It really just depends on how you approach that with your vendor and what goals you have for your organization. A lot of times sections of the revenue cycle, like patient access and mid-cycle charge entry, a lot of those often have different leadership, and sometimes kind of a more segmented approach is required to kind of get all of the stakeholders involved and on board. But approaching things across the revenue cycle is certainly not wrong either. To give a few examples of how we've seen health systems implement, we've had some that, like I mentioned before, start with claim status, kind of to get a more, straightforward product implemented, portal connections created, and work showing up in the queues, decreasing volumes and kind of starting to show some of that value, and then expand into other areas. One of the great things about claim status tool is that it can really help you identify early on what your AR is splitting out to and what's needed next from you to kind of move those claims along in the process. So claim status can be a great place to start, and then immediately start tacking on like additional documentation requests or eligibility issues that you're seeing because of no member found on the portals when you're trying to search status on a claim. So you could go at it that way. Another approach could be that you have a lot of denials. A lot of us are being crushed with denials right now, and you just need support in being able to get them worked and get them back out the door, either as a corrected claim or an appeal. And you could start there. Another approach, though, might be that you have a ton of denials, and we know the majority of those are coming from the front end, whether it's eligibility, kind of billing issues, or auth. And so automating the front end and really reducing the denials by automating and correcting the root cause. Or better yet, automating the front end with the denials and just take that problem off your plate altogether. So you can see there's several different ways, several different examples that can all deliver ROI to you. It's just about how you are aligned with your organization and what you want to tackle with your vendor. But I think that's an important point because I'm asked often, where do I start? How do I start this journey and how do I think about it? And the right vendor will support you and work with you as you think through the options and the appropriate ways to kind of tackle your problems with automation. As we look a little deeper at areas of opportunity where automation can make an impact, it often makes sense to automate what takes teams the most time and have high volume. We did a survey of more than 550 healthcare finance leaders with HFMA and found denials, prior authorization, and insurance follow-up rounded out the top 3 most time-consuming tasks. In our work with providers, we've seen staff solely dedicated to these tasks. And so if you can automate functions in these areas, you can actually redeploy staff to work on more complex work that needs the human touch and focus more on tasks and workflows that are more patient-focused, like financial counseling or gathering more information for the patient correctly up front. There's a lot of areas within the revenue cycle that suffer when there's staffing shortages. And so automating some of these tasks allow you to kind of redeploy that staff and think about them in a different way. And I think that's critical when we think about, as we're talking about ROI and we think about evaluating the value of automation or a process improvement. It's not always staff reduction. As a matter of fact, it's more often than not reallocation of staff. And you can certainly make the decision to reduce staff based on the work that's being automated. But I've often had the conversation with healthcare leaders in my many years in consulting and working directly in health systems. And, the question of like, are you actually working everything you should be working or that you need to be working? And the answer is almost always no, because it's just a reality that we have to prioritize work and deprioritize some work based on the resources we have. We have to try to get the biggest bang for our buck, whether it's really the fully right answer or not. Automation can help you get there in wrapping your arms around a larger set of problems and data and workflows to kind of have a more efficient back-end revenue cycle process there. So when we're looking at investing in automation, I think we all have our list of criteria that when we're evaluating vendors, or more specifically automation vendors, whether it's built from personal experience or whether we have strict organizational requirements on evaluations. Or for some of you, whether you're reporting to a CFO who has their own requirements for ROI, all very reasonable approaches. In our work with the Academy, executives identified the top 3 as a set of non-negotiables, which align with the ability to work within the organization's tech stack and infrastructure. EHR compatibility and interoperability, demonstrated rigor to protect patient data. Is the vendor high trust certified? Do they have the appropriate protocols in place? And are they showing that through certifications? And then the ability to augment EHR capabilities. So similar to EHR interoperability, but like not only can it work within the EHR, but can it meaningfully impact the work that is already being done there in that EHR? However, when you start going down the list, hard ROI is number 4, and as expected. You don't see soft ROI surface until number 15. So it's not surprising that hard ROI stays up top, because we know the leaders are really zeroing in on metrics like revenue capture and cash flow as top priorities for why they want to make this investment in the first place. 78% of leaders rank this as highly important factor when deciding where to invest. But as you go down the list, and I mentioned that soft ROI doesn't show up until number 15, it's a little surprising. But it does show the reluctance of financial leaders to embrace soft ROI. And why is that? I think it's because it's hard to measure, and there's a lack of standard reporting across EHRs and all of the various systems needed to really report on some of the soft ROI metrics. But, when you think about soft ROI, like productivity, efficiency, workflow, workforce impact, and patient financial experience, those things are harder to measure. And there's limited guidance and roadmaps out there on how and when to capture these benefits. So it can be neglected and undervalued in the decision-making process. In my experience, there's a clear desire to measure holistic measurement, but due to the lack of kind of industry standard, there isn't a great way, and it often kind of gets lost in the shuffle. So the question is, how do you get a holistic view of ROI and really truly assess the total value of your investment? Excuse me. So like I mentioned before, hard ROI, when you really start looking at it, it's really only telling part of the story. We know that hard ROI is what financial leaders gravitate toward, but it is critical to not discount the importance of soft ROI. Let's split the two out a little bit and make sure we're kind of on the same page with how we're defining it. So hard ROI, we have, reduced cost to collect, increased yield, avoidable denials write-off rate, some net AR days, net collection rate, things like that are, standard reporting metrics in most systems. But when we look at some of the soft ROI metrics, we're looking at hours saved, authorization rate, number of patients engaged through a specific process, employee engagement, turnover rate, compliance. Are you rescheduling and canceling appointments because your authorizations are not done on time? Is it improving that? But were you measuring it to begin with? Kind of the overrides and the cancellations and the reschedules. The numerous times people are having to touch things because they're not done right the first time. All of those inefficiencies, all of those can roll into soft ROI, even though their results can have a hard ROI impact. Excuse me. So, just again, the traditional ROI metrics just fail to measure the impact on some of the more urgent needs that we're facing today, like shifting market trends, current staffing and engagement concerns, and efficiencies. Soft ROI metrics, which leaders report benefits from automation, include enhanced workflows. 79% of leaders report to benefit from automation on enhanced workflows. Increased productivity or hours saved. 75% report increased productivity with RCM automation. And, fixed specific rev cycle pain points, like an authorization denial or eligibility issues. 50% report to seeing improvement on pain points while using automation. So it's important to really think through capturing all of the big picture as we, do these evaluations for automation and for improvements. Certain external pressures don't get built into the ROI formula. Sorry, I'm losing my voice. Earlier, we mentioned some of the market pressures and some impetus on investment. Those are too granular to reflect some of those pressures. In the last few years, market trends such as labor, fixed cost, and consumerism have rapidly shifted, becoming critical priorities for health systems. Current ROI measures are like tunnel vision, only measuring impact on the rev cycle or financial health alone, rather than the broader implications on strategic priorities that are driven by some of these changing market trends. Given the staffing challenges hospital and healthcare orgs are facing, have you taken into account how many hours you've saved your staff from working on mundane work and deployed them towards more rewarding projects? Or how is your staff engagement? Those are important things to think about. With the rise of consumerism, the patient experience, we all know, is critical to creating loyalty and attracting their business. How is your patient engagement being measured? And what action plans do you have in place to improve it? We have a quote here from a VP of finance in a leading health system of, We just can't expect to staff 1,900 people in the revenue cycle in 10 years. We won't have the people. We need to pay attention to our future needs, and that means more than just collecting money. And it really highlights the need for thinking through the big picture and the more holistic measurement of ROI and evaluation of automation tools. I think healthcare financial leaders are struggling with who or where to turn on ROI measurement. There's a significant gap in the market for guidance and frameworks to really get ROI right. With the Academy, AKASA has created the concept of total value. The total value framework includes hard and soft ROI inputs with respective metrics over a 3-year timeline. The framework provides a roadmap for leaders to level up their ROI measurement and tells the story of full potential of what AI and automation can do in the revenue cycle. This quote from a health system leader really encapsulates what we're trying to help leaders with. They said, you need both hard and soft ROI to tell the whole story and to have a good understanding of the impact beyond the revenue cycle. The value gives a better picture in the world we live in the real world. Many organizations lag in tracking and meaningfully incorporating soft ROI metrics into total value calculations. Most systems will need to evaluate and update the metrics that are currently being tracked to ensure soft ROI is even being captured, much less adequately captured. An emphasis on hard ROI or financial metrics should be the focus in year one. And as you move up in this kind of pyramid, you can see we have the critical influencers of total value of the type of technology, the partner capabilities and additional costs, and then the hard ROI moving up into the soft ROI that can be measured over around a 3-year period of time. It's important to note that 1 year begins once the technology has been fully implemented. It's very difficult to measure hard ROI on segmented scope or smaller portions of scope than what's intended to be implemented, depending on how it's broken down by payer, by service area. And a lot of times the back-end reporting doesn't always match that as scope is expanding to reach full potential of the contract or the design of the automation with your health system. So it's important to note that measuring really does begin a full year after technology has been fully implemented in order for it to be effective. In year 2, we start being able to move into some of the soft ROI metrics, focusing on efficiency, employee engagement, patient engagement, and hours saved. This should now start being integrated in with the hard ROI metrics. It would be good to begin measuring them immediately, but really starting that tracking at year 2. It's, of course, helpful to know your baseline and to know how you're moving from that baseline and what the impact of the automation is. And then in year 3, there should be an even larger emphasis on soft ROI with additional metrics focused on your workforce, patient engagement, productivity, and policy and regulation support. At a minimum, these categories should be measured for at least 3 years with the goal of understanding total value by the end of the 3rd year. And keep in mind that every implementation of every piece of automation and every section of the revenue cycle has its own ROI measurements. So this is a constant ebb and flow. We're kind of moving up and back down the pyramid as we move into the subsequent implementations that you may be doing with your automation vendor. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the total value journey. In order to understand total value over time, hard and soft ROI need to be weighted. So phase 1 or year 1, you see 75% hard ROI metrics and 25% soft ROI, likely only with hours saved in that soft ROI on year 1. Hard ROI should be tracked in year 1 with weighting towards improved revenue outcomes. Cost reduction metrics are added each subsequent year. The expectation is for hard ROI to increase over time, but eventually flatten unless automation is further refined or scaled. Back to kind of my point around adding scope and adding different workflows to it. So when we look at this hard ROI here, we're specifically looking at avoidable denial rate, denial write-off rate, net AR days, denial, overall denial rate, collection rate, cost to collect. And really for the soft ROI, as I mentioned, just hours saved. As we move into year 2 or phase 2 of measuring ROI on this implementation, we move towards a little bit more soft ROI. 65% hard ROI metrics, and 35% soft. We start to place a greater emphasis on soft ROI, which is comprised of some of the harder to measure but critical benefits of automation and AI with 4 inputs: efficiency, patient impact, revenue cycle workflow impact, and policy and regulation. And as you can see, we still have hours saved, and now we're adding, again, number of patients engaged through specific processes depending, patient satisfaction, employee engagement score, vacancy rate, turnover rate within your staff. And the hard ROI stays the same, but you can start adding in some additional measures like total labor budget. And then we move into year 3, and it's more of a 50-50 split at this point of maturity with this implementation. We're at 50% hard and 50% soft. And now that you have a solid foundation, soft ROI will become a bigger part of the overall performance equation in how your automation is performing. And you can see now we've added in compliance, turnover rate, value-based care, revenues, recoupments. It now starts telling the whole picture. You have the hard ROI and the straight financial measurements, but you also are measuring the value within the workflows and the impact of the automation and these improvements you've put into place on both your patients and your staff in a meaningful way. Realizing the total value of automation investments requires clear communication and collaboration, both with your internal audiences and with automation and AI vendors. RCM leaders must define ROI measures, both hard and soft, from the outset to avoid roadblocks down the line, which can diminish those measurement efforts. Tracking the measures you care about is often impossible down the line if not clearly defined up front. And this is critical because we just mentioned, earlier in this conversation that part of the reason, we think healthcare finance leaders are not measuring soft ROI is because it's difficult to measure, because there aren't standards, there aren't guidelines or as many guidelines, and there aren't as many standardized reports available to track this kind of information. So if you are working to implement soft ROI measures, you still need to know what they are now and really begin working to remove those barriers immediately on those measurements with an implementation that is, say, starting in the next few months, because you still want to be aligned on what you're tracking and how you want to measure it in that phase 1 through 3 or year 1 through 3 of 75-25 to 50-50. So it's critical to start removing those barriers now by defining and aligning on the soft ROI metrics you want to measure and how you're going to measure those. That will allow you to have consistency throughout the phases in your measurement so that it's meaningful data that you're able to actually evaluate. IT, for example, plays a critical role in vetting vendors, deploying automation technology, and ensuring the ongoing tracking of ROI functions properly. IT leaders are a key audience to engage early and often when mapping out your automation journey. I don't know if you'd be surprised or not to know how many IT leaders or tech leaders are not brought into an automation discussion until almost the very end. And if you haven't experienced this, I can tell you that it causes problems because they want to be able to vet, of course, those top 3 non-negotiables with EHR interoperability, with security, with all of those things. And sometimes just kind of filling out the internal security form doesn't check that box well enough, or it checks the box for the form, but not for the buy-in and engagement of your IT and tech leaders. So it's very important to pull them in early and often so that they are on board with whatever support is needed for you throughout the project, as well as wherever they might need to be supporting measurement of ROI and tracking. Additionally, ensure you're asking questions related to vendor support and if there's any additional costs associated with implementation and deployment to avoid hidden expenses. Some vendor must-haves are data tracking and reporting, deep rev cycle expertise, and flexible technology that can support an ever-changing environment that we are currently in or have always been in with healthcare. Not only do our regulations change and our rules change, the portals change, customers, your patients' coverage of record changes frequently. We're dealing with all of these changes on a day-to-day basis. And if you are going to deploy automation and look to have meaningful ROI attached to that, it needs to be flexible enough to support all of those changes. And then lastly, measuring total value is a team sport. If you rely on multiple automation vendors, they all need to provide inputs into your larger effort to track and measure ROI. That should be defined with them up front. And that partnership with your vendor should assist you in being able to track those ROI and find the data for that ROI. Treating them as a true extension of your team and ensuring they have the bigger picture can help them better deliver what you need to tell the whole ROI story. So one key finding that stood out to me from our HFMA survey is how little vendors seem to be involved in ROI measurement for revenue cycle automation. Only 7% of automation AI vendors calculate ROI for their customers. And I understand they may not be able to be inside of your data and calculating, some of your internal metrics, but they should be able to support you in partnership with you bringing the data you have to the table and then bringing theirs off of time per task, hours automated. There's a lot of pieces of soft and hard ROI that the vendors can help you, or the vendors should be able to help you measure. The status quo really isn't acceptable if only 7% is kind of working in that way as a partner with their customers. Measuring ROI is a team sport. So vendors should be an extension of whatever hospital or health system or practice they're working with and take an active role in that ROI measurement to help providers capture the impact of RCM automation. Your automation vendor should be helping you tell the full story instead of a piecemeal kind of siloed approach where only the health system's measuring this and they don't have the information they need from the vendor or even have to ask for it frequently. Ensuring the right KPIs are set up according to your workflows that leverage automation so both hard and soft ROI can accurately be measured is critical. You don't want to try to measure an irrelevant metric as it's related to your workflow. So if you are working authorizations up front, you should be measuring authorization denials. And you should be measuring those denials for the scope for which the authorizations are being automated, if that's specific to service area, work queues, et cetera. So it is really important to make sure that your metrics are matching and that the workflows that are being deployed in an automated way are the metrics to measure them are being defined and they're being measured properly on the back end to show the improvements that you're looking for from each implementation or each automation. So I think it's really important here to cover, we're talking about how to track and we're talking about how to realize the ROI. One of the biggest or some of the biggest barriers to total value are ineffective change management, staff resistance to automation, and unrealistic timelines. In parallel with implementing the automation and thinking about what needs to be tracked from an ROI perspective, it's important to think through how the roles of your team should evolve over time as you can redeploy them to other work. So we'll talk about change management first. Not every organization has a team of people that when they see work dwindling down in one of their work queues, they know where to go next. And so it's really important that as you're mapping out your automation journey, and in every area of your revenue cycle that you have automation being deployed, that is going to impact your team. It is very similar to bringing in a virtual workforce to support your team, because now you have, kind of a virtual FTE through your automation that is, 5 to 15 times more productive than your team members. And if you were to bring in new hires and sit them down to be onboarded and trained with your staff, you would immediately be thinking about what work will be assigned to the new hire versus what work will be continued to be worked by your existing staff. The same holds true for automation. And this is one small kind of portion of what you need to think through from a change management perspective. But I think it's a critical area because you have to be actively managing this. And as the contract signer or the project sponsor, you may not be the one closest to that work and to that workforce management and workflow and productivity management. So you need to have a cohesive kind of understanding from that supervisor, manager level up through senior leadership, so that the intention of the automation is understood across the organization, and that every level of leadership understands how they're implementing it, what that's going to look like in their day, and what they need to be thinking about for their staff. This is also important because we talk a lot about, as more mundane tasks are being automated, you're able to upskill your rev cycle staff and move them to more complex areas of work that uses more of their brain and more of their skills. This might require a little bit of training to upskill them or exposure to new workflows. And you need to be doing that early and often in your automation process so that they're ready to transition. And it's more of a seamless transition as automation is ramping up, their work queue is, going down, and they know exactly what the next thing they should be working is. So this is really important. And if you let automation take place and everything stays the same on your teams, probably their productivity goes down, or maybe it stays the same because you're now getting your arms wrapped around more, but it's not necessarily what you wanted them to work on, or it's not necessarily what's giving you the most value for their work. You aren't going to realize the ROI that you're looking for. You will get some, but you're definitely not going to be able to realize the maximum impact of the ROI there. So that change management piece is critical. And it really also relates to staff resistance to automation, because appropriately kind of having a change management process early on in the implementation that involves all of those layers of leaders and gives them a clear picture of what to be expecting and what's expected of them in managing this, the rollout of this automation and where they put their staff. All of that also supports staff engagement and staff adoption of the automation. So you want to curb the resistance to automation. There is automatically a fear that if you're automating work, then people aren't going to have jobs. Well, I mentioned this earlier, and I think it's a fair point in time to be transparent with your staff. Like, listen, we don't get to work everything we need to work. We just have too many constraints. This will allow us to do that. All this is doing is allowing us to get our arms wrapped around more of our AR than we were doing before. In some cases, you might be looking to reduce headcount, and that's fine too, but it doesn't happen overnight. And more often than not, all of us have open headcount. And so reducing headcount does not necessarily mean letting people in seat go, as much as it means today, in our current environment, not having to fill all of the open positions that are posted. That's an important message to explain to your teams if that is in fact the situation you're in. So that they can be excited about the automation and that the support that your department overall is receiving and the work that it's going to be able to do to serve your patients better. Lastly, unrealistic timelines can just be a morale killer for both your implementation team, your expectations on when and how to measure ROI, and just overall satisfaction. So it's really important to partner with your vendor and understand the timeline for the implementation. And as we mentioned earlier, know that yes, you can start tracking ROI on day one, or start tracking the metrics to get a baseline of where you are today on day one. But know that you shouldn't expect the needle to be significantly moved until you're at that 1 year mark. And that is where the rubber should really meet the road and you're able to start seeing that ROI. So having a realistic timeline in mind as you're evaluating your products and your work, as you're going through the implementation with your vendor, is really critical so that you know how to forecast the realization of those savings and of that return. Oops, sorry about that. So I will close here with just an example of how one of our customers deployed automation and used it within their within their health system. So this is a multi-state customer of ours with around $1 billion in net patient revenue. At the graph on the far left, it depicts the production volume for them month over month, starting on day one, as you can see that tiny little bar there. And that's production and claim status, which was automated. And so you can see that it grows across, the year and a half pretty significantly. Now, what's interesting is in the middle of the chart, you can see the dip there. And it's important to note that's a COVID related dip. That kind of March, April, May, June, July is around COVID. And one might think, well, why wasn't the automation happening? But we know that outpatient procedures were being, put on hold. And what this specific organization had to do is send their entire rev cycle home and teach them all to use VPNs, connect on laptops, and work in a way the vast majority of them have never worked before. And that, kind of lower volume bar actually shows the ability that this health system had through automation to keep things going in a time of complete disruption. So anyway, this just shows through, from the very day one of very low volume to now of their claim status product is doing status for that of 19 FTE equivalents, just in claim status based on the hours automated and the tasks being performed. And you'll notice that increase happens pretty rapidly if you look at that chart. In the middle there, so, specifically kind of spotlight on the claim status, we're doing about 19,000 claim status checks per month, again, about 19 FTE equivalents. And what this health system did, which kind of speaks to the roadmap we talked about earlier on where and how to deploy automation, they started in claim status, and then they expanded their production into the patient access area or portion of rev cycle and engaged with eligibility, prior authorization, price estimation, and they're a Cerner client who uses Experience. So some of the RQA alerts or the eligibility rejects that are coming across on their eligibility side. And they decided to automate those pieces along with eligibility denials. And they partnered those knowing that, eligibility denials are a big issue in their organization. They were rolling out a new integration with Experian, and their alerts were out of control and just didn't have enough people to work them, and used automation to solve some of that problem. In addition to doing some coverage discovery checks monthly for like Medicaid patients and things like this. So, and they're actually also looking into and have expanded into other areas as well throughout the revenue cycle at this point. From this work over the course of now 2+ years, they've seen a $30 million gross yield increase and are spending 86% less time on status checks across authorization and claim status. So they've really been able to realize value in their products, in their automations and their implementations over this period of time. And again, as they've implemented multiple portions of automation across their revenue cycle. And then I'll just close. We talked a little bit about the Academy and HFMA. This last slide has some information about them that you can kind of utilize if helpful. And with that, I think we have time for some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Amy. I'd like to transition now over to our Q&A portion for the remaining time. For our webinar attendees, please feel free to enter any questions you may have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to address your question in the time remaining, we're happy to follow up with you offline. Let's go ahead and see what questions we have. We had one coming from Jason. So why do automation companies continue to hold up claim status as the holy grail of automation benefit? Claim status is not even an activity in a next generation revenue cycle and has little to no value, whether it's done automated or done manually.
So I love that question. I completely hear you. I think that not everyone is in the same phase of headed towards the next generation. And I think a lot depends on their different health systems' abilities to utilize some of the EDI transactions that can be earlier indicators of claim status. There's also some value in a more holistic claim status product that is returning more than, like, let's say a 277 response does. But really depending on the integration within the various EHRs, not everyone has the same opportunity to have a more integrated kind of EDI fed claim status process. And it is an area where there are a ton of automation vendors. It is a more, in many ways, for the way that many automation vendors deploy claim status, is a more simple task. I think something to ask for claim status deployments is, are you just bringing back basically the information from an EDI transaction? If so, most people can probably get that in their EHR. Or are you bringing me back richer data that allows me to take action sooner on denials, requests for informations, eligibility issues? And are you moving accounts to the correct queue for attention, putting the correct action codes or information into that account? So there's varying degrees of what's being offered right now in the claim status market. But you're right, it doesn't feel like it feels like the thing that will be obsolete next. But I do think there's probably a surprising number of health systems that aren't there yet, and that still struggle with it and spend many a man hour just checking claim status to know what to do next. So at least with our tool, the benefit of claim status is that they already know what to do next, and they immediately go tackle that instead of spending the time on the portal or getting the detailed kind of responses back and making sure that they understand exactly where the claim is in that payment pipeline.
Great. And another question, how did you convince senior leaders to be patient enough to wait 6 to 12 months to measure ROI? CFOs want results now, not in a year.
Yeah, I completely understand that. And by the way, also understanding that I just said the reason we're looking for automation as healthcare leaders today is because they need this financial impact, right? They need it desperately. And so I think there are many things that can be taken away or that can be measured on kind of more of a micro level to be showing as early indicators. The whole ROI picture can't be told until like kind of full implementation. And once you get through that and your full swath of kind of like the workflow is live. But you can be looking at things by payer. You can be looking at things to show them where the lift is occurring, or to show them, a decrease of days in AR in a specific segment of your AR, as opposed to broadly for, the whole financial metric. And so that's what we usually see our leaders kind of communicating to their financial executives in the interim, as well as just communicating expectations up front and making sure it's something that can be agreed upon across the organization as far as when it will be live, how long the implementation takes, when it will be live, and what the anticipated timeline is to kind of get fully live to start actually realizing that ROI. So there's some metrics you could probably agree on in the interim that can be measured and start showing early indications of successful ROI.
Okay, and Eric has a question asking if you have any recommendations for smaller hospitals, critical access hospitals, or rural health clinics.
I'm not sure if that's recommendations like overall or for like kind of how to track ROI or for like what automation to consider for like the biggest ROI. I think that it really just depends on the situation that you're in your area. And I know community hospitals have a lot of unique problems. They, have they are serving their community, and that is of paramount importance. And I think, going as far upstream as possible and solving problems at the root is likely where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And so, is that in your patient access area? Is that where you're struggling the most? Would some sort of eligibility tool with coverage discovery support you better so that those people can be patient focused and, working on the patient experience and not kind of doing eligibility checks, behind their desk instead of greeting patients? Is it something as simple as claim status because you don't have those things in place yet, and that's just an area where you have needs? So it really depends on, what area of your organization you're struggling with the most. And sometimes is really just where you have the most open headcount because you just can't get it filled. You need to implement some automation or deploy some sort of automation or AI in that area. So I think a good vendor would be able to kind of have that conversation with you and help you walk through what you're experiencing today and where best to plug in.
Okay. Yeah, Eric followed up that he meant recommendations for resources for smaller hospitals, if that changes your answer at all. Or we can move on to the next question if not.
Okay.
Okay. So Patrick has a question. So is the investment in RCM automation mostly in capital or operating expense?
Actually, I do not have the answer to that question, so I'll have to, we can get back to you on that one.
Okay. Another question. What's the most surprising thing coming from this research? Did it change the way you think about ROI?
I thought it was an interesting partnership. One thing that it did help me, I'm not a CFO. I've worked as, I've led rev cycle departments, and I've struggled myself with why can't I make them understand this case of how important these things are. And so I know the struggle kind of firsthand as I'm trying to get something in place. So I think it was helpful to kind of like solidify what I experienced and knew, but probably didn't, pull together nearly as eloquently as far as those standards aren't there and the standard reporting isn't there. And so just broadly, it's not something that can be adopted across the industry as well, or that's why it hasn't been. So it made a lot of sense. And so I think, not necessarily a surprise, but I think kind of a helpful validating point, if you will, and then kind of like oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that, I think otherwise I see a lot of this day in and day out. And so it was really helpful just in our partnership to kind of have it pulled all together and hear from many healthcare leaders, whether they're our customers or my colleagues that I know from the past and, things like that, to pull together really like what the general kind of thoughts are around ROI, because it is a hot topic and it is difficult at times to kind of create that full picture. And I think a funny example of this is we were talking about ROI with, I was having an ROI conversation and said, well, they said, well, I need to see the hard ROI. I said, well, okay. And the answer was, well, we closed down 17 open requisitions. We were able to reallocate those people to other areas. We were able to reallocate those people to other areas. They said, well, that's not really hard ROI. And it was kind of like, sometimes just that translation isn't there. So, they were able to move their staff and redeploy them. And they actually were also able to take on more work without adding staff. And that is hard ROI, but it wasn't already kind of there in black and white. And so, sometimes it's just about how we talk about the problem and like presenting it data first to kind of make that translation.
Okay. And another question. What is a reasonable implementation time for a single automation?
Yeah, it really depends on what's being automated and your vendor and what type of automation you have in place. There's a lot of, kind of RPA shops that, are kind of put some of that in your hands, and that's great. There's limitations on what straight RPA can do. And so if it's a more complex implementation of a more complex workflow, it could take longer. But I would say from go live to full kind of expansion, it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months to 9 months, just depending on complexity of workflow. And that's just kind of on average across, the industry in comparing various, implementation timelines on kind of all the products. But there can be great difference between the different types of products.
Okay. Let's see. We have a question from Chris. Can you share best practices or conduct a future webinar on change management when implementing a virtual workforce or reallocation of employees?
I would love nothing more than to nerd out on change management and employee kind of resource management. So that is absolutely something we can take away, and our communications people are on the line. So I'm sure they have that note. I would be happy to.
Okay, another question. This is a short and sweet one. Who owns ROI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I said a couple of times it's a team sport. It really is, because there are many inputs to ROI, and they don't all happen with a neat, tidy financial analyst assigned to the CFO. In many cases, that's not the world that many of our healthcare executives live in. So I think that as far as who owns the reporting, it depends on your organization. Who owns, impacting that ROI? It really does boil down to the leaders of each of the areas, to again make sure they're kind of getting staff engaged, doing that change management, getting staff allocated to the right areas, and really supporting the effort of the automation by increasing the work that their team is doing, by making sure they're moving people, getting that training in their hands and things like that. So really everyone owns ROI, from the top down, when a contract's signed, to the execution of the implementation and the work that's being done.
Okay, looks like that's all the questions we have coming in. So we'll wrap up here. So that's all the time we have. I just want to thank Amy again for an excellent discussion. Also to AKASA for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future Becker's webinars. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.